My name's Matt Ridley. It's great to be here at Google. I've spoken in Mountain View before, but I've never been here. But I gather this is much more important than Mountain View. I write books when I'm not doing other things. I'm also a columnist for newspapers. And I also have a sort of part-time day job these days in the UK. I sit in a very, very old-fashioned institution called the House of Lords, which is a very powerless arm of the British government, but I can talk a little bit about that as well if you want. And it might seem the message of this book is very anti-elitist, so you might think that's a bit weird coming from somebody in the House of Lords, but I'll explain as I go on. My last book was called The Rational Optimist. I don't know if anybody here read it. It was chronicling the amazing improvements in human living standards over the last 50 years, and the fact that the average person on the planet is earning 3 times as much as they were 50 years ago, that they're living 30% longer, they're burying 2/3 fewer children, the greatest measure of misery anybody can think of, and on the whole, people are wealthier, healthier, happier, cleverer, kinder, cleaner, more peaceful, freer, and more equal than they've ever been. And what I was interested in was why this is happening. What we're seeing around the world, this extraordinary transformation happening now much more fast, much more rapidly in Africa than any other continent, a continent that people thought was not going to be able to catch up with the rest of the world and is now doing so. And the answer, of course, in a word, is innovation, which is something you guys do here, I imagine. And where does innovation come from? How does it happen? Why does it happen to us and not to rabbits or rocks? And what drives it was kind of what I was interested in that book. And I've taken that idea quite a bit further in this book, because my answer essentially is that innovation is about the combining and recombining of ideas, that virtually every technology we can think of is a combination of other technologies. And so it's just a matter of combining technologies in different combinations to come up with new technologies, and there's an infinite number of ways we can do that. Because I'm not just talking about objects, I'm talking about rules, I'm talking about ideas as well, and that is the fuel that drives innovation, and that's why innovation happens where people can meet and exchange ideas, or as I put it, ideas have sex with each other so as to produce baby ideas. That's very similar to how biological evolution happens. Biological evolution depends upon the recombination of genes. Genes being thrown together in new combinations through sexual reproduction in particular is the fuel that drives biological evolution. But of course there's another stage to biological evolution, which is selection, that it's no good just having random mutations and new combinations of genes. You then have to have the environment pick out the ones that make an organism more fit, and as a result of that you can build complex organisms from nothing, from the bottom up, without a plan, without a designer, without an end in mind. And that's the essence of the idea of natural selection, of evolution by natural selection. And my argument in this book is that human society changes in exactly the same way. It's not even a metaphor. It's precisely what's happening with any information system where you're getting recombination of information. You're going to get selective survival, in this case because we choose the ideas ourselves rather than because the environment chooses them, and that is going to result in progressive and constructive change of an incremental, gradual, inexorable kind, which is essentially a form of evolution. That evolution has jumped into the technological sphere as well. And that as we look around the world and look at how we change society, we need to understand that most of the important things that happen in terms of changes in human living standards and so on are not driven top-down by plans and people who know how to get end results. They emerge from the interactions of ordinary people. That's why I say this is an anti-elitist book. I think the idea of Darwinian evolution by natural selection is one of the greatest insights that's ever happened to our species. Dan Dennett calls it a universal acid, and what he means by that is that there is no container you can hold this idea in. It eats through everything you try and hold it in. It undermines all sorts of ideas about the world because it gives you, for example, complexity and order and fit between form and function without design, without somebody knowing in advance that that's what they want to achieve. The human eye, for example, is a complex organ which is designed for seeing. It's pretty weird to think of it in any other terms but having the function of seeing. And yet it came into existence without anybody planning that it should be for seeing. It came into existence in a bottom-up, spontaneous way. So I essentially argue in this book that biological evolution of that kind is the special theory of evolution, just like the special theory of relativity, and that the general theory of evolution is that this happens in systems without genes as well. It happens in information systems, it happens in technology, it happens in culture, it happens in morality, it happens in religion, it happens in music, it happens in government, it happens in all these aspects of human behavior. And of course, natural selection there's a phrase for it really, which makes it much more clear, which is trial and error. Trial and error is actually how we change society when you think about it. We don't tend to plan one goal and go straight for it. What happens is that lots of people try different things and some survive and some don't. Some ideas persist and some get left by the wayside. If you look at a technology in the early stages of its development, there's a ferment of different ways of doing it out there, some of which get selected and some of which don't. So for example, if you look at the designs of early aeroplanes, there's a wonderful plethora of different designs, different numbers of wings, different shapes of tailplanes, different places for the propeller, etc. That for the first 20 years or so of aeroplane design, there's an enormous amount of experimentation, and then it gradually settles down into the best designs from that. So trial and error is much more important in human innovation than I think we give it credit for. And we tend to make the mistake of thinking the world is a more top-down place than it is. We did this for 100 years with respect to biological evolution too, of course. The intelligent design movement still persists to some extent in many parts of the world where people refuse to believe that it's possible that the complexity of a human body or of a rainforest ecosystem could have evolved without a designer. And we're still struggling to get our heads around that idea of bottom-up design in the natural world. And even more, I would argue, in the human world, do we tend to make the mistake of thinking that someone's in charge, someone designed things, someone planned things, whereas in fact a lot of it is spontaneous order that we're looking at. Now, my book is a little bit what you might call Procrustean. That is to say, I'm trying to squeeze everything into my theory, and occasionally I might fail, and I've got chapters on the evolution of pretty well everything you can think of. And some of them are more persuasive than others. But that's kind of my point, is to sort of push this idea as hard as it can go and see what pushback I get. And people are saying, don't be ridiculous, you're overdoing the bottom-up view of the world in some of the reviews. And they may be right, but it's part of my purpose is to try and challenge people into recognizing that things are not as top-down as we think they are. Talking of top-down and bottom-up, I use a metaphor throughout the book, which is the sky hook. A sky hook is a hook that you attach to the sky in order to build a building from the top down, which would be extremely convenient if we could invent it. Maybe you have invented it here at Google. And the phrase comes from a First World War reconnaissance pilot who was in an airplane who was flying around, and he was told to stay up there for an hour because we're out of action and we'll get back to you in an hour. And he replied, this machine is not fitted with sky hooks. And that's, if you look in the dictionary, that's where the word originated. And of course, sky hooks don't exist. Dan Dennett uses them as a metaphor for intelligent design. He says that essentially when people say that the human body or the human eye was designed by a creator, they are essentially inventing a skyhook. It's a kind of mystical shortcut explanation to how things came into existence. And I think we see skyhooks everywhere in human society, and we need to unlearn seeing them. Just a couple of examples to give you an idea of evolution in human affairs. Think of music, for example. Music genres change over time. They change gradually, they change incrementally, they build on what came before, they take the previous genre and twist it slightly. It's a descent with modification, as Darwin put it. You can see the family tree of different musical styles, and you can see how two different musical styles come together and breed, as it were, to produce a new style. Gods evolve. Gods used to be vengeful, petty tyrants who got cross if you didn't do the right thing. Now they are disembodied spirits of benevolence. You can see that change happening in lots of different societies at different times. And they haven't finished evolving yet. They're going to keep changing. It's a bit cheeky to say that gods evolve, because gods are supposed to be the opposite of evolution, but there we are. Governments evolve. Government kind of always started, if you go back in history, as a protection racket. It essentially was one strong man saying, I will have a monopoly on violence, in exchange for which I will ensure peace among you guys, as long as you give me all your money. And you can actually see governments, you can see the recreation of that happening today. For example, prison gangs in prisons are essentially imposing monopolies of violence within prisons, saying, we do all the violence, nobody else can do it. And that's a sort of incipient government, if you like, governance arrangements within prisons. So obviously governments go on to do other things. They evolve into things that have welfare states and justice systems and economic planning functions and all that kind of thing. But that's how they started. Cities evolve. There's an extraordinary regularity about the way cities develop. As they reach a certain size, they get certain features into them. And there are scale economies of cities that are surprisingly regular and predictable. Now, these are all examples of things that are the result of human action, but not of human design. That's a phrase that comes from a Scottish philosopher of the 18th century called Adam Ferguson, who said that a lot of things are the result of human action but not of human design. And it's something we just don't really have a word for. We know that this object is an object of human action and human design, whereas the clouds from which the rain is falling are neither a result of human action nor of human design. But there's lots of things, when you think about it, that are man-made but not planned, not directed by human beings. Really good example is the English language. The English language is man-made. Obviously, it's ridiculous to say that it's not that it's a natural phenomenon, but it is. But nobody's in charge. Nobody started it. Nobody invented it. There is no central committee. There's no chief executive of the English language, thank goodness. And it's an enormously complex thing with huge amounts of order in it, huge amounts of rules and structure to it. Rules that we're not even aware of and yet we use. For example, the rule that if you use a word frequently, it becomes very short. And that you can't change the meanings of short words, but you can change the meanings of long words infrequently used. Those kind of rules, I bet you weren't even aware of those rules. I wasn't till I did some research on this. And so we're obeying the rules of the English language all the time, and yet there's no one enforcing them. There's no law court to prosecute you if you don't use the English language correctly. At least I hope not. So that's the kind. Now, that's obvious for the English language. I'm trying to say that a lot of other things, like our moral sense, like our religious behavior, like our technology, actually are of a similar character. I go right back 2,000 years to the start of this to get inspiration from a wonderful Roman poet called Lucretius, who wrote a poem called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, around the time of Cicero and Caesar. He died while writing it because it seems to be unfinished. The poem disappeared for 14 centuries because the Christians didn't like it. It was rediscovered in a German monastery in 1417. And the wonderful thing about that poem, which expresses the Epicurean philosophy, is that it's tremendously modern in the way it sees the world. And it basically says that the world consists of atoms and voids, nothing else. There are no spirits or gods or special features of living creatures as opposed to non-living things. Living things are made from atoms and voids just like non-living things are. Well, that's right, actually. 2,000 years on, we know that he got that right. And all that you do to make new things and to make living creatures is recombine atoms and voids in different combinations. And so he gets very, very close to describing evolution by natural selection 2,000 years ago. And the rediscovery of De Rerum Natura was a fantastically important event. It became terribly influential on philosophers of the Renaissance and the Reformation, as well as the Enlightenment. From Spinoza to Thomas Jefferson, there were a lot of people who were huge fans of this poem. And I'm sort of saying we should understand it today and move on with it. Adam Smith in 1759 wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments before he wrote his book, his more famous book, The Wealth of Nations, which expresses this bottom-up view of the world really rather well. And it's a very subversive book because it says that morality is something we decide among ourselves as ordinary people by calibrating our behavior against other people's reactions to our behavior. So essentially you decide based on how people react whether killing is right or wrong, if you like, or whether theft is right or wrong. And so it'll come to different conclusions in different societies and at different times, but that it's a sort of consensus view that emerges among people about what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do. And it's very subversive because essentially he's saying we don't need priests to tell us what's moral. Priests are just reflecting back to us what we've decided among ourselves. But the priests keep going around saying, if we didn't tell you what was right or wrong, you'd have no idea. And he's saying that's not true. People work out among themselves what's right or wrong. But of course, Smith then went on to write The Wealth of Nations, which makes the same argument about the economy, that essentially the economy is not run by the government. It doesn't matter whether someone's in charge of deciding who trades with who makes what. What counts is that people have the chance to negotiate among themselves, and supply and demand and the price system will produce a surprising amount of order and sophistication and detail without anybody being in charge of it. And he famously put it, the sovereign is completely discharged from a duty in the attempting to perform which he must always be exposed to innumerable delusions, and for the proper performance of which no human wisdom or knowledge could ever be sufficient. That is the duty of superintending the industry of private people and of directing it towards the employment most suitable to the interests of society. In other words, if someone tried to tell New York today how to organize itself, how to feed itself, how to get the right amounts of food to everybody in New York tomorrow, we would fail dismally. It would be a right cock-up if someone was in charge of feeding New York. And yet New York gets fed every day. Just the right amount of food gets to the right amount of places every day because of spontaneous order. So I'm making quite a direct analogy here between economics and ecology, between the way a rainforest comes into being and functions and between the way an economy comes into being and functions. Each species has its place in the rainforest, each business has its place in the economy of a city or a country. But not because someone has decided and planned that each species should be in the right place in the rainforest or each company should be in the right place in the economy. By the way, this idea that trying to extend evolution to cultural and social and economic systems is exactly the opposite of social Darwinism. That phrase which was used in the 19th century for the idea that we should understand evolution and interfere in human reproduction in order to achieve progress in society. That we should actually tell people that whether they can or can't breed, whether they should or shouldn't be sterilized, and whether they should or shouldn't live. That's essentially the social Darwinist idea, because if we don't do that, society will deteriorate, whereas if we do that, society will progress. This is the exact opposite of that. This is saying evolution is now happening within cultures and societies irrespective of what we do to the biology of people, so that the great thing is ideas can compete and, if necessary, die, so that people don't have to die. So this is, I think, a far more humane view of the world. There is now a very sophisticated theory of cultural evolution. Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson and Joe Henrich are the main protagonists of this, and it's been modelled very closely to understand how culture evolves and whether it evolves and under what conditions it will show natural selection. And it turns out that these are really quite permissive conditions. In other words, you don't have to have a very close analogy to genetics, to faithful replication, and to strong selection. You can have weak selection and not very faithful replication of ideas and cultures, and you will still get a natural selection leading to a constructive, spontaneous order. We tend to walk around assuming that someone's in charge, as I said, and when we see something being done, we assume it's either being planned or it's being messed up by someone, whereas it might be being emerging spontaneously. And this is a manifestation of what's sometimes called the great man theory of history, and it goes right back to our sort of deep instincts, which are that we tend to have the intentional stance. When a thunderstorm, when somebody gets hit by a bolt of lightning, there's a little bit of us that says, oh yeah, he must have done something sinful in order to deserve that, or there must have been purpose behind that. We find it hard to believe that events are random in that sense. And that, I think, leads us to credit people with too much credit when things go right, the person in charge, and to blame them when things go wrong. And it's true that great men can take history by the scruff of the neck and turn it in a different direction, but usually in a bad direction. As Lord Acton said, great men are mostly bad men. Hitler, undoubtedly had an influence on history. Hitler was not a bottom-up phenomenon, he was a top-down phenomenon, and a bad one. Now, what does this mean for technology and innovation and the kind of business you work in? And it's a little subversive. I'm here to say that individual inventors, individual geniuses probably don't matter as much as you think, that it's ordinary people interacting with each other that produce the results. To give you an example, Thomas Edison gets the credit for discovering the light bulb. But if you go back and look at history closely, there are 23 different people who deserve just as much credit for inventing the light bulb independently around the world in the same decade to roughly the same idea. I mean, there's obviously differences. In Britain, we say Joseph Swan deserves the credit for the light bulb, not Thomas Edison. In Russia, they say Lodygin deserves the credit. And we're not wrong. These people did come up with the idea independently. It's just Thomas Edison was the best businessman among them. And what that's telling you is that the light bulb was ripe. It was ready to be invented at that time. It was inevitable that in that decade someone would invent the light bulb. And the same is true of scientific discoveries. Charles Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection because Alfred Russel Wallace was threatening to pip him to the post because he'd come up with the same idea. Newton came up with calculus, so did Leibniz at the same time. Einstein came up with special relativity. If he had fallen under a bus, Henrik Lorentz would have come up with it within a few years. Watson and Crick discovered the double helix in the early 1950s. If they didn't exist, or if, as Crick once put it, if Watson had been killed by a tennis ball, what would have happened? Well, then undoubtedly someone would have discovered the double helix of DNA, probably within a year of that discovery. So in that sense, great scientists and inventors are dispensable. I mean, somebody needs to do the discovery, but it doesn't really matter who, and we tend to give too much credit to the person who's there at the time. Google is surely a good example of this. When Google came into existence, 1994, I think, around then, it was one of many search engines that were already out there. The search engine had to be invented around then. I mean, it was, by the way, I think it's one of the great inventions of my lifetime. I use it every day. We wouldn't use the word Google for searching today if Google hadn't existed, but we would certainly know the concept. And that's characteristic of an evolutionary system, that it's moving under its own steam. The technology is choosing its inventors rather than the other way around. You can see why this is a little bit subversive and perhaps not terribly popular with, I wrote some of this in a Wall Street Journal article the other day, and elite scientists and inventors don't really like this idea because it tends to take them down a peg. And I'm not saying that they don't matter, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be investing in discovery and invention. Of course we should. It's just that we need to understand that this is a system with its own momentum that we need to encourage and draw out rather than try and plan and decide what happens next. Just to ram home the point about simultaneous discovery, Kevin Kelly documents in his book What Technology Wants that we know of 6 different inventors of the thermometer, 3 of the hypodermic needle, 4 of vaccination, 4 of decimal fractions, 5 of the electric telegraph, 4 of photography, 3 of logarithms, 5 of the steamboat, and 6 of the electric railroad. And even, if you go back and look at Harry Potter, it turns out there are lots of books about wizards who use owls that come out around the same time. It's really weird, some of the things that happen in that sense. The internet itself is a really good example of a thing that is the result of human action but not of human design. Now you may say people were involved in the inventions that led to the internet and the design is part of it, but actually if you look closely, someone was bound to come up with packet switching as an idea or the other technologies involved in it. If DARPA hadn't come up with the ARPANET, it would have emerged somewhere. It's impossible in the state of computing and communications of the 1980s and 1990s that computers wouldn't have got connected and some form of internet would have emerged. And if CERN hadn't employed Tim Berners-Lee to invent the World Wide Web, someone else would have come up something very, very similar. Actually, the origin of the internet really lies in lots and lots of ordinary people doing peer-to-peer networking. That's the crucial, that's the hard work that was done to put the internet together. People who you've never heard of and people who were often involved in the sort of sharing model. It's very much a bottom-up thing. Actually, Stephen Berlin-Johnson points out that the internet's not even bottom-up because that implies that there's a top, which there isn't to the internet. Nobody's in charge of it. There is no central committee of it, thank goodness. People keep trying to get in charge of the internet, as I'm sure you know, but long may they stay out of it and long may it evolve. Where's it going next, the internet? I think the internet is artificial intelligence, if you like, because human intelligence is basically a collective phenomenon. We share ideas and collaborate on things. And I think artificial intelligence is going to prove to be a collective phenomenon too. I don't think individual robots is where it's coming from. I don't know where it's going next, but I do have my suspicions. And by the way, you shouldn't take this as gospel because nobody can predict the future at all well. That blockchain looks to me like the most interesting thing that's coming next because of the ability that it has to build trust, which is crucial to economic activity, without a third party being involved, whether it's government or lawyers or other expensive people like that. Where does blockchain come from? Well, we give one bloke the credit for it. He's called Satoshi Nakamoto, but luckily we don't know who he is, although we have our suspicions. But actually, it's even when you go back to that, it could well be that Satoshi Nakamoto is a combination of 2 people or 3 people, and the whole idea is gradually now emerging through the interactions of lots of different people. So I think that's kind of the future of the internet. It hasn't, if it's evolving, as I say, then it's hardly started its evolution. There's an enormous amount of development to go in the way the internet is going to develop and change our lives. And just to end on a sort of funny story about a friend of mine in the House of Lords who's a bit too elderly to get involved in some of these internet things, as he calls them. Social media, he recognizes he finds it just too difficult. He says, I can't be bothered with social media. I don't really even know how to use it. What's this Twitter thing? What's this Facebook thing? But he realizes it's important and it's part of life. So he's got to understand it, and so he's decided what he's going to do is to do in real life what people do on social media. So he goes up to people in the street and tells them he likes them and shows them pictures of his cats and his wife and tells them what he had for breakfast and that kind of thing. And it's working. He's got followers. He's got 2 policemen and a social worker after him. So evolution is happening to all of us. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, go to the microphone.
All
Good
right.
thinking.
One of the things that evolution tends to produce is hierarchy. There's hierarchy in the sense of our nervous system. There's hierarchy in the sense of most governments are hierarchical in some form. The internet is hierarchical in a lot of ways. Google may have arisen from a bunch of competing products, but now we are, the biggest search engine is run by a large hierarchy. How does that play in with your overall thesis?
Well, I would challenge you slightly and say that it doesn't produce as much hierarchy as we think. So, for example, when the genome was being sequenced, there were people saying, now what's really interesting, we're going to find out the master genes. Let's work out what the master genes are. And that idea just faded away as people realized there are no master genes. The genome is a completely parallel network thing. It's ridiculous to say one gene is more important than another. And I would say that the internet's still a pretty unhierarchical place. I mean, you say it's got hierarchy. Is that really true? It's true, though. I think what you're getting at, and you're absolutely right, is that when we set up organizations, we tend to make them like armies with generals and then colonels and then majors and that kind of thing. And that has been the fate of most companies. It's not absolutely essential that we do it that way. And I have a section in the book on a wonderful company called Morningstar Tomatoes, which is the biggest tomato processing company in the world, based in Northern California, which is completely without hierarchy. Totally. There is no chief executive. There's nothing. People negotiate with their peers their salary and their job description when they join. And you can vote each other out of the company. It's an extremely successful company. There are other companies who are looking at that and saying, how do we do that? And every time people get interested in it and go back to the ranch and say, look, we should really try and emulate this company, they run up against their existing hierarchies, which say, well, we can't possibly do that. So I think we haven't yet tried very hard in the corporate sphere to build things without hierarchies. Now, again, you might say this is a bit rich coming from a member of the House of Lords, and you wouldn't be wrong. I live inside hierarchies too. I don't think the nervous system has much of a hierarchy. Again, we've tended to think in terms of one bit of the brain being in charge of the rest, but it's actually a misleading way to think about the brain. It's very parallel, it's very flat in that sense. So hierarchy comes from our top-down tendencies rather than from evolution itself, which is much more bottom-up thing, would be my answer.
So since you brought up the House of Lords, this is off topic, but can you tell us more about just House of Lords and interesting things that go on there? More specifically, I guess what I'd be interested in is, to what extent it's obviously very rare for the House of Lords to do anything to actually stop a bill, but there has to have been some incident where does each member research a proposed bill to stall themselves, or you get told by the whips or the parliamentary equivalents to be like, hey, do something here, or is it just so quiet that you don't even, it's just a show up every once in a while? Yeah.
No, 10 days ago we were in the middle of a huge constitutional crisis caused by us overreaching our powers and turning down a government money measure which hasn't happened since 1911. And the television cameras were live watching us vote, and we, the government side, lost the vote, and that meant that the bill died. And this, there were a lot of people saying this is outrageous. This is flouting the will of the elected House of the Commons. So no, as it happens, things have just got rather exciting in the House of Lords in recent weeks, and that's because the government party is very strong in the House of Commons but very weak in the House of Lords, for various reasons at the moment. How does it work? It's the upper house of the British Parliament in theory, but because it's unelected, it's supposed to have very, very few powers. We don't have a written constitution, so what we do is we work these out in terms of conventions, in terms of habits. And it's been agreed for about 100 years that the House of Lords will never really stop the Commons passing legislation, but it will insist on amending it in kind of sensible ways. The question is, what's a sensible way? So we debate every bill that goes through Parliament, we amend them. Often our job is to scrutinise and improve legislation, that's the theory. We tend not to vote purely on party lines, although that's increasingly not true. Increasingly it is getting party line. But there's a balance of power held by so-called crossbenchers who are non-partisan. Most people are appointed. Some get there because they inherit the right to stand for a by-election to get there. It's really weird, but this is a temporary situation. That's how I got there. So, I mean, I'm going way down into the details of the very odd British constitution here. But we are a democracy. We're run by the House of Commons. That's where 90% of the power lies in Britain. But the House of Lords is a kind of revising chamber attached to the House of Commons, and we're in the middle of a crisis about its role at the moment. So watch this space. That was rather more than you bargained for, I think, in terms of British constitutional history. But okay, just one thing about how we're hierarchical. Every day when I sit in the House of Lords, I look up and there are these statues of men in suits of armour between the windows. Those are the barons who signed Magna Carta 800 years ago this year and brought in, now admittedly they were pretty elitist blokes themselves, but they brought in this idea that even the king must be subject to the law, which was a totally new idea and a very far-reaching one, and one that had an enormous influence on your founding fathers, etc., etc. Sorry, enough on that.
Could you talk a little bit about patent and copyright law in light of the idea that ideas intermingle in order to create new ideas, and that the person who came up with it isn't particularly important, and that maybe they shouldn't own that idea?
Yes, I'm somewhat of an anarchist on this. I think we've gone much too far in terms of intellectual property rights and intellectual protection. I think on the whole it's beginning to stifle invention rather than encourage invention. I think on the whole business of giving either a Nobel Prize or a patent to somebody tends to be a bit unfair, because although they've done a brilliant job, so is the person one link down in the chain or one link up in the chain. And so that said, the purpose of a patent was to persuade an inventor to publish what he'd done so that other people could use it. That's what the word means, to make it patent, that what you've done, not to keep it a secret. And to some extent, you do still find that does help. The fact that people are publishing patents does get information out there that would otherwise stay secret. But increasingly, outside the pharmaceutical sector, where patents do play a very important role because of the enormous cost of safety testing before you bring something forward, so that there needs to be a reward for people to doing that. But outside the pharmaceutical sector, I'm bothered by the fact that patents are increasingly used as toll booths, as barriers to entry, as ways of milking revenue from, by suing companies for trespassing on your property, rather than as ways to help innovation in itself. Patent troll is the phrase used for companies that do that. I think it's gone too far in that direction. A little bit of intellectual property protection is a good thing. Too much is a bad thing. I think, particularly in the US, it's slightly too far to that side. Copyright, well, as an author, you'd think I'd defend copyright. Actually, I don't. I think it's ridiculous that for 70 years after my death, you will not be able to reprint my words without the permission of my executors, except unless you do a very small chunk. That's completely crazy. I mean, I quoted a couple of lines from the song "What a Wonderful World" in my last book, and I discovered I had to approach 3 different owners of the copyright on that. I don't know why it was 3, but then I had to pay $250 to each of them or something. It's mad. I mean, this song was written in the 1920s. Everybody knows the words. Yet if you print them, you have to pay these. So Shakespeare didn't have copyright. People wrote down his plays hurriedly in the back of the theatre and then published them. Didn't stop him writing plays. I think we've gone far too far to assuage Walt Disney Company on this.
So it sounds like a lot of what you're describing is like memes, as described by Richard Dawkins, refined by Susan Blackmore. Can you comment on if you endorse their ideas, or are you presenting something subtly different?
It is and it isn't the same thing. I'm a great fan of Richard Dawkins' work generally. I think the idea of the meme was a really useful idea. I think Susan Blackmore's exposition of it, as you said, was brilliant, actually. And she made a very persuasive case that actually this is quite a useful way of looking at the world. But it slightly predates this Pete Richardson, Rob Boyd, and Joe Henrich model of cultural evolution, which essentially says that the stuff that evolves doesn't have to be particles. It doesn't have to be lumps, as it were. The meme is an attempt to say, like a gene, there have to be units of information that compete with other units of information. It can be much more blurred around the edges than that theory implies. The object can expand and contract and include other things, and yet you still get evolution in it. So I think it's a bit restrictive, that way of looking at it. And while I think it's a huge contribution, I feel it's moved on since then.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question. So as we know, evolution is the process by which things change to fit their environment, and the ones that best fit the environment continue. This doesn't always mean that those things are better for humanity or for us. It doesn't mean that they're better in any way, depending on how you define better. As you said before, Hitler can be seen as a top-down phenomenon, but I guess he could also be seen as a bottom-up one because he was in an environment that then produced such a person. So my question is, how do we reconcile our own agency to actually change things and plan things if we're looking at the world from this kind of purely naturalistic view where everything is kind of chaotic and happening? Yeah,
I don't think everything's chaotic, by the way. I think the great thing about natural selection is it produces non-chaos, out of chaos, if you like. But and you're absolutely right. There's a bottom-up nature to the early 20th century dictators. There's something about the state of technology, the state of society in the early 20th century that encourages the emergence of demagogue dictators. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin. There's plenty of them, Franco, etc. And I think it's radio. I think the invention of radio was a technology that helped demagogue populist dictators to come to power. And if you notice Oswald Mosley, the man who tried to become Britain's dictator, the one thing he really wanted from Hitler was money to help start another radio station. So I think the role of radio in the 1920s and 30s is, as it were, a bottom-up phenomenon driving dictatorship. So you're not wrong there. And yes, bad things can evolve just as good things can evolve. Computer viruses, cybercrime, there's evolution happening in those kind of things. But as those two examples, computer viruses and cybercrimes, show, on the whole, the good guys will win because the good guys can do it in the light, the bad guys have to do it in the dark. And therefore, when you're doing it in the light, more people can join in, more people can contribute to it. That's one point. And the second point is that the selection part of natural selection, in the case of evolution of human institutions and culture, is us, ourselves. We're choosing whether to, adopt a new technology or not. And if something's really bad for us, we're not going to choose it. And if it's really good for us, we are. So in that sense, there's going to be a bias towards good things emerging from this process rather than bad things, I think. That's sort of my answer to your question. And that's where agency comes in, human agency, because humans are the agents of natural selection in this kind of evolutionary system.
Thank you.
I was wondering, do you think it makes sense to only rely on the sort of bottom-up efforts to, improve humanity and go forward into the future? Or do you think there's a role for some top-down efforts as well? Like, just to give an example, the Apollo program, very sort of top-down effort. We haven't had anything really close to it since then because there hasn't been such a huge government emphasis on it. And a lot of people, me included, and certainly a lot of Googlers would say that getting into space is obviously a very important future goal for our species, like multiple baskets and whatever, or eggs, don't put all your eggs in one basket, whatever, that kind of thing. So what do you think about that?
Yes, you're right. Of course, there's a role occasionally for top-down. It would be wrong to, ban anyone from ever doing anything in a directed, planned, or top-down way. The Apollo program is a good example, but it's probably an example of something that would it have emerged anyway without government doing it? I suspect it might. I mean, it's going to the moon would have been something that ordinary people would have come up with and got together the finance for by now, maybe not by 1969, among themselves. It's true that, but and why hasn't it led anywhere? I mean, given that we've got the technology to go to the moon, why has it not been followed up? Partly, as you say, because government has decided it doesn't want to keep going to the moon. It's got better or different priorities for its money. And partly because we haven't figured out a use for going to the moon yet, I think. I think that's the really big difference. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm perfectly happy to say, yes, occasionally we should do top-down things, and to heck with evolution, as it were. It doesn't matter that evolution doesn't want us to go to the moon. Let's try and go there anyway. I just think that we need to recognize that an awful lot of the time we solve our problems by allowing the evolution of the solution rather than the imposition of the solution. And a really nice example for me of that is China's one-child policy, which is a very top-down solution to a problem of population. It literally came about because a rocket engineer called Song Jian went to a conference in Helsinki in 1978 on control systems theory, and there he came across a lot of the population movements, concerns about population explosion, and a lot of the writing in the West, which was talking about the need to compulsorily control populations. And he went back and translated that into a policy, became very powerful, and the whole policy took off. And we now know that it wasn't a great success. It was probably a failure because the population growth rate in China had fallen faster without coercion before it was brought in than afterwards. So it was a failure in terms of its outcome, but it was also a failure in terms of being a very inhumane policy. So that's an example of something where the bottom-up solution, the demographic transition, whereby as soon as people get a bit wealthier and healthier and better educated, they will lower their birth rate because people like to invest in quality of children rather than quantity, that the bottom-up solution would be better than the top-down one. But you're right, there are other examples, like the Apollo program is a good one.
In your theory of general evolution here, have you formulated any views on meaning and whether any meaning can be left if everything is just goalless evolution towards some unknown end?
What's the meaning of life? 42 is the answer, isn't it? I was a great friend of Douglas Adams, so I think his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the computer comes up with the answer 42. I personally, and this is where it's up to you as a person, I personally have no problem with the idea that life is in the end meaningless. That I'm the product of a natural process. I find that actually much more magnificent that for 4 billion years living creatures have gradually changed to produce me, silly little me. None of my ancestors died young. It's a weird thought, isn't it? But it's true. Most creatures die before they get to breed, but none of my ancestors did. None of your ancestors did either, because otherwise they wouldn't have bred, etc. You know, I think there's true, as Charles Darwin put it, there is grandeur in this view of life that gives it much more meaning than any idea that we're here with a purpose. So I'm quite happy to abandon purpose and still find meaning in life. That's not, I know, the way everyone reacts to this. One more, good.
So I haven't read the book, but do you talk about sort of the rate of evolution perhaps being connected to the interconnectedness of people, and as well as simply just like the number of people? And perhaps how the internet has certainly fueled innovation in that way, but perhaps plans on expanding, for example, going to Mars and colonizing that as a path toward accelerating our evolution, essentially.
Well, I really enjoyed that book, The Martian, and I enjoyed the movie too. But I suspect that's a long way off in terms of helping our evolution as a society. I certainly think that, I mean, I argue that the meeting and mating of ideas is what produces innovation. And that's why you get innovation in places with a lot of trade throughout history. Renaissance Italy, Song China, Fujian Chinese people, Gujarat in India. You know, wherever there's been a lot of trade, you tend to get a lot of innovation. Victorian England, Holland in the Golden Age, California today, you know, etc. So places where people can meet other people freely and invest and be free to do what they want and change ideas are terribly important. And we've just created a virtual one of those that's global, or very nearly global. Almost everybody's involved in it. And that has to be accelerating the rate of evolution. Because a man in Shanghai can swap ideas with a man in San Francisco today. Sorry, a woman in San Francisco can swap ideas with a woman in Shanghai today, just as, you know, in a millisecond. They don't have to get on a ship and go and meet each other, etc. And even compared with 20 years ago, the rate at which ideas are meeting other ideas must be accelerating. And that's why I'm slightly puzzled we're not yet seeing what my friends at Singularity University say is going to happen, this incredible acceleration of technology. And part of the problem is we run up against diminishing returns in certain technologies. So transport has changed very little in my lifetime, whereas communication has changed enormously. Opposite in my grandparents' time, communication changed very little in the first half of the 20th century, but transport changed pretty dramatically. Yes, I think we are generating possibilities. I certainly don't think innovation is going to slow down. And if you look at the growth of world GDP, it's unbelievably steady. There's 1 year since Second World War when it was negative, 2009, by less than 1%. It grew by 5% the next year, so it was back on track. It's just like this straight line. But actually, when you think about it, because it's a percentage thing, that straight line means it's an exponential thing, means it's accelerating all the time. And you extrapolate that to the end of this century, and the average person on the planet will be about 15 times as rich. No, sorry, will be about 3 times as rich as the average American is today. You know, those are unbelievable numbers when you think about it. And sure, there's a lot could go wrong, and we could hit some brick walls along the way. But if that doesn't happen, the potential for what we can do with innovation for the human race is truly amazing, I think. Which might be a good moment on which to end, because we've got 3 minutes left. And anybody else want to?
One more?
One more, go for it.
Okay,
yeah.
So the question of hierarchy keeps coming up as a strategy. It's clear that you, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're saying we overestimate hierarchy. We see hierarchies in everything because it's a natural tendency to do so. Evolution has selected hierarchical behavior as a strategy
Yes.
because it's successful, especially in social animals.
Yes.
So
Alpha males in primates particularly, yep. Yep.
just as an organizing principle so that you can mobilize resources and actually accomplish things. So I'm curious to hear where you see these hierarchies being useful as opposed to being encumbering things. Like, for example, they did make efforts to sort of standardize language so that we can actually speak a common language, even though that might have been a natural process that it came from. There seems to be these two forces of top-down, us trying to organize things, and then bottom-up things kind of happening. So my question is, how do you kind of reconcile the two?
Is there anything top-down about language?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there are opposing forces in language, right? There's the natural linguistic laws that shape language, but then there are groups of people coming together saying, like, we're all going to agree to call this a chair and not a fufafa, whatever, because you guys over there call it one way, we call it another. Like, we agree implicitly, but also explicitly through, like, standardization of how to call things.
Yeah, but that's still pretty bottom-up. That's still ordinary people kind of voting among themselves rather than any hierarchical body. Now, it's true the French set out to standardize French language and to extinguish non-French speakers within their territory, force them, as it were, to switch to French, as it were. And they still have this committee that tries to decide whether you're allowed to say le weekend or not. But it doesn't get very far. And look at Esperanto. That's a top-down attempt to create a language. Didn't get very far. So I would challenge you that there is really anything very top-down or hierarchical about language. But
can it be both? Because it doesn't have to be the government or a large body. It could be a group of people getting together and agreeing, though, saying that this is
did that really happen? I mean, when did this meeting happen?
Internet standards, for example. The internet wouldn't work if we didn't all get together and agree on certain ways that things were going to communicate with each other. And that had to happen with the organized group of people saying, like, this is now we're going to agree on the truth, and this is going to go forward.
Yeah, but I would argue that even that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, was some group of programmers sort of putting out their standard and it either being rejected by the community at large or accepted by the community at large, much more than, I mean, ICANN, is it called, the Internet Committee for the Assigned Names and Numbers, yes. Thank you. It likes to kind of pretend it's in charge, but I'm not sure it really is. In other words, I'm sort of slightly saying to you that I think you're still falling for a top-down view, which isn't correct of these things. But yeah, standards do have to emerge. There's no question about that. But I think in the internet, standards have emerged rather than been imposed.
Well, yeah,
correct me if I'm
we
wrong.
Could say that all top-down systems have emerged because of bottom-up things, right? Like governments have come to
the
be
one-child
because they're
policy
the ones that
didn't
actually survive, right?
Yeah.
Some governments make it, some don't. Some systems make it, some don't. So my question is kind of how do we can we reconcile these two views and say well, sometimes hierarchies are useful if we choose them wisely.
Yeah, of course, and you're absolutely right. And I'm not suggesting we sack the president tomorrow, although you do that in next November, don't you? And appoint a new one. But I am suggesting we just err a little too much, or quite a lot too much, in the direction of thinking hierarchy is needed when it's not.
Yep.
And it probably wouldn't be much fun trying to fight a war with an army which voted on whether to attack. But then I don't think we should be fighting wars, so that's a way out of that one.
That's how American Indians fought.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Well, they were quite good at it, weren't they?
Yeah. No, but I mean,
All right.
the Indians had no armies. That it was
Yes.
a couple of leaders came up and come with me. And
Right.
some people came that had a war.
Right.
Best example, considering.
Yes. I like the way this conversation's gone into some interesting directions. Thank you all very much. I was 1 o'clock the time I was supposed to finish. I don't know, but anyway.